Kia ora, welcome. We are live. My name is Amanda Larsson. I'm a senior campaign manager here at Greenpeace Aotearoa, and today we're going to be talking about water. And you might know that for the last 3 years, Greenpeace Aotearoa has been offering free water testing services for rural communities around the country. We have had hundreds of conversations. We have tested literally thousands of water samples from all across the motu. And today we're going to be digging into the reasons why water is becoming increasingly contaminated here in Aotearoa. We're also going to be talking about reasons for hope, lessons from past campaigning, and what we can all do together to help reverse the degradation of rivers, lakes, streams, and drinking water. So here to talk to me about that today, we have Will Appelbe. Will is our freshwater campaigner here at Greenpeace Aotearoa. He's a relatively new addition to the team, but he has been working on agriculture issues and campaigning for animal welfare for many years. So please welcome Will. We also have my wonderful colleague Jules Thern, who has been involved in our campaign to protect drinking water since it all began. She has tested hundreds of samples of water from all around the country. So welcome, Jules. And I also just want to say a big shout out to all the people behind the cameras tonight. We've got Clay, we've got Rhiannon, Elliot, Reza, and Nick. It's a big team effort, so there's lots of people behind the scenes making all this work today. And I also want to acknowledge you, everyone who's watching back at home. We're going to have some hot takes on this issue. You probably have some hot takes too, and we would love to hear your questions in the comments. I'll be putting those questions to our panel. So ask us what you want to know about fresh water. So just to introduce our speakers, I want to go to you, Will, first. You grew up in Canterbury. You have witnessed firsthand the degradation of rivers and lakes in your part of the country. And could you tell us a bit about some of the kind of precious streams and rivers that you grew up with, and what inspired you to become a freshwater campaigner?
Yeah, kia ora, it's amazing to be here. So I grew up in Timaru. It's South Canterbury, 2.5 hours drive south of Christchurch, which is where I live now. I spent many weekends throughout my childhood in the rivers in the region. The Ōpāhi River was a common. We would spend lots of time at the Ōpāhi River, swimming, camping, building fires. Particular spot is just outside of Pleasant Point, which is slightly inland from Timaru. Also further up the Ōpāhi River, there's a campground in an area called Raincliffe. Spent a lot of time up there as well. And the Pāriora River as well is nearby Timaru. There's a wee ford called Evans Crossing. I spent lots of weekends there when I was old enough to drive. And all of those rivers, I wouldn't swim in them anymore. They're not always technically unsafe to swim, but the sites that are monitored regularly test for elevated levels of E. coli. So I certainly wouldn't take the risk, and I wouldn't suggest to anyone else that they take that risk either. And that's been a huge driver for me, really. That's only really happened in the last 15 to 20 years. That's my story, but it's not a particularly unique one either. That's a story that thousands of people across the country have to contend with, especially in Canterbury. And when you speak to folks who talk about the rivers from 40, 50 years ago, it was even better back then. Yeah. As a kid, we were told not to drink the water because of giardia, but we could certainly swim in it. Whereas, we've been speaking with folks who many decades ago would drink, swim, eat from the rivers. And that's changed.
Yeah, as you say, that's not a very unique story, and we're going to be talking pretty soon, actually, about some of the people that you've spoken to out in rural Canterbury over the weekend. So thanks, Will. And we also have Jules. So Jules, you grew up in Germany and the UK, but you've been living here in Aotearoa for more than 10 years with your family. Before coming here, did you have this kind of impression of a 100% pure New Zealand, like the tourist ad campaigns advertise? And has that changed as you've lived here and worked here?
Yeah. Hi, Amanda. Hi, Will. Kia ora. I think when I first came here, I definitely maybe I'll rewind. I grew up in East Germany. So I was born behind the Iron Curtain, and the environmental record at that time was not great. And so I think coming from very populated countries, there's often a lot of environmental issues at the forefront. And so moving to a really remote country where the population density is low, you just kind of expect it to be a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely had a different feel first coming here, especially, you know, you go to the beach and no one's there, and you can go on a bushwalk and meet nobody. But then when I started working at Greenpeace, I was straight in on the oil campaign that we were running at the time. And so it makes you realise that even though New Zealand has got this amazing clean green image overseas, the reality is maybe not that different. You still have big corporations coming in and being driven by profit, and they are willing to put things at risk for that profit. And I think in terms of the water side of things, that became quite a reality for me after having kids, because all of a sudden you want to take your kids to the beach or, you know, down to the local stream to have a play in the water. And all of a sudden you go, hang on, is that actually safe? And you go and you check out Swim Safe, and you go and check out some of the websites like the Land, Air and Water, Aotearoa, and you go, oh, hang on a minute, actually it's not as clean as I would have expected. Yeah. So definitely a reality check.
Yeah, and that's kind of brings us neatly to what we're going to talk about mostly today, which is the connection between healthy water and healthy people. And, you know, health, I guess the health of humans is inextricably linked to the health of our environment. And that's not surprising when you think about it, because humans are part of nature. So scientists have recently found that the kind of safe limit for nitrate in human drinking water is the same as what's safe for the ecology of rivers. And yeah, it sounds pretty logical when you realize that humans are animals too, and we're all just part of nature. But it seems to be something that has been forgotten in our political and economic culture, that we are dependent on nature for our very survival, that water is literally life. And that is something that's well established and acknowledged in many indigenous cultures, but seems to definitely have been forgotten in our current political environment here with the new Luxon-led government. Will, you have been filming this documentary. You sort of alluded to the fact that you've been meeting a lot of people. You were off in rural Canterbury over the weekend filming a documentary about people's experience and concerns about water contamination. Do you think that people on the ground understand this connection between healthy water and healthy people better than our political leaders realize? Yeah,
I think some of the political leaders are in for a bit of a reality check because there is an increasing awareness of the state of our water in Aotearoa and the flow-on effects from that, whether that be the impacts it has on our biodiversity, which is in crisis at the moment, the impacts it has on drinking water. People are becoming much more aware about this. It's been interesting ever since I was offered actually this role at Greenpeace, and almost every conversation I've had with people in Canterbury where I mention what I'm doing and what I'm working on, they'll hear, oh, water, nitrate. That'll keep you busy, because people get it. People they've switched on to the fact that the dairy industry essentially is polluting our water, and there's certainly certain communities that are more aware of it than others, and those are the communities that are essentially impacted by this in their day-to-day lives. Folks in places like Oxford and Darfield, other parts of rural Canterbury, where their water is testing for elevated levels of nitrates, almost up to the MAV. In some areas, if they are on a private bore, it could be above. They're getting increasingly concerned about the safety of their drinking water.
Hey, Will, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to ring my little jargon bell. I think you're going to have to tell people what the MAV is before we can continue.
Good call. So the MAV is the maximum available value level, and that is set at 11.3 milligrams per litre. That's set by the government, and that that level was set back in the 1950s, essentially to protect folks from, or babies from blue baby syndrome. But it doesn't take into account the more recent science, which we'll talk about in a moment, that tells us that nitrate levels much below that level could increase the risk of colorectal cancer and preterm births. So there's some increasing concern around rural Canterbury, but it's important to note as well that a lot of these folks who are more aware of it now, have become more aware of it, they're Pākehā. Tangata whenua have been, in a lot of cases, banging their head against the wall in terms of the degradation of their freshwater for decades, and they've been up against, in some cases, up against a brick wall, in other cases just treated with outright racism. It's getting easier for those folks, some of the folks that we spoke to, but there's still an uphill battle there.
Yeah, you started telling us a little bit about the kind of science around the new emerging science around health risks associated with nitrate contamination. Can you delve into that a little bit more detail? Yeah,
so the legal limit, the legal maximum is 11.3 milligrams, and it's at that and above where there's a risk of blue baby syndrome, essentially where the nitrates make it difficult for the blood to circulate oxygen around infants. But the College of Midwives, they take a precautionary approach where they recommend 5 milligrams not to drink any water that's either that 5 or above, because it can increase the risk of preterm births. But the more recent science has showed us that even 1 milligram of nitrate per litre could increase your risk of bowel cancer by 4%. And for each additional milligram, it further increases by 4%. So that's what the more recent science is showing us, and the frustrating part of it is the regulators and the government are not taking this more recent science seriously and are not taking a precautionary approach, thus sticking to the 11.3 milligrams per litre, which in our view, and in my view, it's far too high.
Yeah, and now I'd like to go over to you, Jules, because you've been raising awareness about this issue of the health risks of nitrate contamination in town hall water testing events around the country. So you've attended more than 10 town hall events from Canterbury to Southland to Taranaki to Waikato. You've tested hundreds of samples. Can you tell us what are some of the most common things that you hear from people who come to those water testing events?
Yeah, I think probably the first thing that people will tell us is how grateful they are, actually, without bigging us up. But it feels like people are going, oh my goodness, there is actually there's an organisation that's taking this seriously and that's coming to us and offering us this free service. And so one of my roles in these testing events has been registering people. So when they come in, they bring us their sample and we take down some of the details about the water. And just that initial interaction usually is one of curiosity around like why Greenpeace is doing this. And then there's the just that relief that someone is there and taking it seriously. And then I think there is quite a lot of, say, apprehension and shock when it comes to hearing some of the results, because we've tested water where the council supply, so what's the rural supply or the town supply, is actually quite high. So it's not reaching the maximum allowable value that Will is talking about normally, but it can be around the 5 milligram mark or over. And so then that has significant risks for families in the areas. Because they might be at risk of having premature babies or underweight babies. So I think for me, that's one of the big things that always resonates again, where people go, oh, okay, I didn't realise that. We thought the government would set a level at a responsible point, and it's not necessarily there. And then the other really tricky thing, or the other thing that often comes up, and that I think can be really tricky, is the question around solutions.
Yeah, right.
Because solutions aren't super, well, yes, solutions are technically very straightforward. You need to stop the input of the bad thing that causes the water pollution. But at the end of the day, in terms of immediate changes that people can take and that they have control over, that is not quite so straightforward. Especially if some of the ways of potentially getting nitrate out of their drinking water is at quite a high cost. And so there is something where you feel like we really want to help. What do we do now?
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more later in the program about what exactly is causing the nitrate contamination and what some of the solutions are to stop the pollution at source. But yeah, it is really hard to tell people when they say, right, I've got this high level of nitrate, what can I do? And you kind of say, well, it's really one of those examples where the pollution is caused by private interest, and then the cost, the impact on people is really socialized across the population, and it's quite expensive and difficult to get rid of that nitrate. What are the highest readings that you have seen during your time doing this testing, and where were they from?
Maybe I'll start with my very first water testing event that I got to join, and that was in Glenavy. So very, very south end of Canterbury. And we had gone there because the town supply was actually reading above the maximum allowable value.
Wow, okay.
And so there was already a lot of kind of community engagement. And funnily enough, the testing event was at the town hall, at the kind of community hall that was right next to the tank with the water. So that was being supplied by council because the reticulated supply was contaminated, and was probably the best place for the advertising the event.
Yeah,
somebody had put a poster on there, very smart, and so that was a real shock because that was a council supplied source of water that was reading for us at about 10.
yeah.
In terms of private bores, we've had readings above 20 all around the Motu. So that's starting in Southland, where I remember a dairy farmer being, I think it was around 21. But similarly, we had people in Ashburton with readings above 20. We've had people in the Waikato with readings above 20. I think that one was at 25. And it's really hard when you have those results and you have to go over to people and explain to them what that actually means, and where you're kind of going, you're almost off the scale here. It's not a good feeling. And similarly, when we haven't talked about it yet, but we offer a mail-in service where people can send us samples of their water, and I test those, and when the machine pops up with those readings, every single time you get a lurch in your stomach because you think someone's been drinking this.
Yeah.
And what are the implications for them and their whānau and their health?
Yeah. If anyone who's watching is curious to know what the results of our tests have been, there are literally thousands, it's 2,000 samples, I think, that are on the Know Your Nitrate map. So you can have a look at the map, see where some of the hot spots for nitrate contamination are. And I'm going to be asking Jules some questions about the map later on in the program, specifically why we made it and how we made it. So stay tuned for that. But first I want to ask you, Will, so you mentioned that you grew up in Timaru. And you also did your recent road trip through Canterbury. What does the landscape look like, and how has that changed since you were growing up in the 1990s?
Yeah, it's certainly changed a lot. The Canterbury Plains, South Canterbury, it's always been, agriculture centre of the country. That was certainly the case when I was young, and it remains the case now. The animals on the land have changed a lot though, and I was thinking about this the other day. When I was about 15, we had a German exchange student come over. A girl from Germany came over to stay with us. We picked her up from Christchurch Airport and drove south to head home, and as soon as we got out of the city boundaries, looked out the window and she said sheeps, because obviously that's the narrative that you know, internationally for a long time Aotearoa was known for, that, you know, we're a land of sheep. And that was certainly the case. And I've made that trip up and down the state highway between Timaru and Christchurch more times than I can count, and it's most of those sheep have been replaced by intensive dairy farms. And there are irrigators everywhere. The grass is very green, and in times of the year when it really shouldn't be that green, and it's because of the synthetic nitrogen fertiliser that's poured on the land. So it's happened in some ways quite quickly, but in other ways it's just kind of happened, you know, without you really realising, until one day you go, you know, there's a lot of cows here, you know, and so yeah, it's the land use change has been significant for sure, yeah.
Well, you painted us a picture there of all these large pivot irrigators, you know, the fertilizer being put onto the land, and that kind of, I guess, kind of industrial scale farming, if you like, where you've got these big robotic arms and like trucks with fertilizer and so on. So yeah, how all of that has transformed the landscape so you can farm heaps more cows than I guess you would without all of those inputs. Can you explain to us kind of technically, like, how does that use of the landscape, the irrigation, the fertilizer, the cows, how does that lead to more contaminated rivers, lakes, and drinking water?
Yeah, so it's, and you mentioned the industrial scale of it, because it really is. I think a lot of the agriculture sector, the agriculture industry, like to think of their farming practices as natural, because it's mostly pasture, it's not factory farming, so to speak, where you know, most of the dairy cattle in Aotearoa are raised on pasture. But it is an intensive industrial process because of the large scale irrigators that are needed to grow the pasture, especially in Canterbury, where we've had these, you know, canals built around the plains to feed the irrigators. And to have that many cattle on the land, especially in Canterbury, you need these industrial inputs to be able to grow enough feed for the cattle, which is why we have these larger irrigators and why we have so much fertiliser going onto the ground. And what's essentially happening is the cows are eating this pasture, and the nitrogen is passing through them, and it's leaching into the soil. And in the parts of the country that have quite porous rocky soils, like in Christchurch, it does not take long for it to leach into the aquifers. And that's where we start seeing the problems. It's, you know, from the aquifers it goes into the waterways and damages the waterways, the rivers, and causes the biodiversity loss, and it goes into the drinking water. So it's that cycle of the irrigation, the fertiliser going into the land as pollution, as runoff, and seeping into the water. Yeah, that's what's causing this pollution and this degraded water.
So we've been talking a lot about fertilizer, which maybe isn't the most exciting subject, but I assure you we've got an exciting video that'll tell you all about it. A video with props to explain how all this fertilizer ends up polluting waterways, what it's used for. Have a look and we'll cut away to that video.
We love nitrogen. It's really useful. It makes plants grow. Amazing. Plants with nitrogen, plants without nitrogen. They use it to build proteins and chlorophyll, all that good yummy green stuff. In nature, plants get their nitrogen from the atmosphere. These super cool soil bacteria suck it down into the soil for the roots to use. Chemical fertiliser companies also love nitrogen. What they won't tell you is that their nitrogen, their synthetic nitrogen made in factories, completely sucks. It messes with our rivers, our climate, our soils. Chemical fertiliser companies make nitrogen synthetically. stick it in a bag, and sell it to farmers. The most common form of synthetic nitrogen is urea. At the Kapuni factory in Taranaki, they mix fossil fuels with atmospheric nitrogen in a super hot, pressurised place with an iron-based catalyst. Not so natural. Since the 1990s, the use of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser has gone up loads. Like, not double or triple, but 7 times. What's also grown in this time? The number of cows. No coincidence. Synthetic nitrogen is used to grow the grass to feed the hungry monster that is intensive dairy farming. More cows, more urine, more nitrogen pollution getting into our lakes and rivers, causing algal blooms, dead fish, dead rivers. Synthetic nitrogen means more grass, which means more cows, which means more, pardon me, burps. That's the methane talking. Not to mention the other greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, emitted from fertiliser and cow urine. It's 289 times worse for the climate than carbon dioxide. Here in New Zealand, agriculture contributes 49% of the greenhouse gases responsible for climate change. Not possible without the use of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser. Who's behind all of this? Ravensdown and Balance. 2 corporates that sell 98% of all of the fertiliser used in New Zealand. It's time to wean our country off synthetic nitrogen fertiliser. We're calling on the government to ban it. We can grow all the food we need without synthetic nitrogen. Using regenerative farming, we can rebuild our soils, look after our rivers, our health, and our climate. Great, eh?
Hopefully that was educational for you all and it didn't feel like you were in a school classroom. I'd like to cut back to Jules because you have seen the direct impact of this intensification that we learned about in the video on people's lives through the hundreds of conversations that you've had with people on the ground in rural New Zealand. Mm-hmm. What are some of the stories that have stuck with you the longest?
There were so many. There were so many people. I think one of the ones, one couple that came to see us in the Waikato was really hard hitting because that was one of the really high readings, and they brought their sample in and they actually knew that they had quite high nitrate contamination from previous testing that they had done, I want to say something like 10 years ago. And they didn't realize the implications. They thought, oh, we're okay because we're just drinking this water. We're not feeding it to any toddlers. There's no risk of blue baby syndrome. And then as we started talking about the health implications, they said, oh, but our daughter in her late 20s is living with us and she's trying to get pregnant and it's a real, struggle, and that was really heartbreaking. And then on the flip side of that, the really kind of hopeful switch there was that when we touched base with them again a little bit later, they had managed to switch their water supply from their bore to a rainwater tank. Mm-hmm. And that was really, it felt like a really positive outcome in the sense that in the immediate term, at least, they were able to do something that was better for their family. Mm-hmm. And I think that probably wouldn't have happened without that interaction. Mm-hmm. And there were some quite hard-hitting moments. I remember a pregnant woman coming in Glenavy, which was the really high town mm-hmm. supply, and just having to have those conversations, and at least being able to then say, but you should just switch to bottled water, or at that time at least they were already on a different supply because council was supplying something else. And then there were those sorts of moments where you could really see that people were struggling to actually cope with the news that they had been given. So many people, especially older men, would put on such a brave face of just going, oh, well, you know, somebody had to have the high reading here, you know, that's all right, it's just me, and kind of almost skipping out of the place, and you kind of go, okay, well, they are clearly going to take some time to process this, and that's quite heartbreaking. I
remember the first couple that you mentioned, I remember being there as well. They were farmers themselves, so I think, from memory, they were sheep and beef farmers. Okay. I think organic sheep and beef farmers. But that just kind of reminds me, I think many of the people that you have spoken to are farmers, including dairy farmers. You mentioned when we were chatting about this the other day, an event you went to where there was gumboots lined up outside the venue. So, you know, often we get questioned in the comments on Facebook and so on, like, oh, does Greenpeace hate farmers? But actually through this program, we've interacted with a lot of farmers who are concerned about their drinking water. Yeah,
very true. And I think that's, that is a very... Yes, I remember telling Amanda that I have this really beautiful image of coming round, having taken a break, coming round to the hall where we were testing, and the gumboots being lined up, and people talking about the realities of farming and how hard it can be, of kind of balancing the books, but also wanting to do the right thing. And they are aware. They know people know what's going on. It's not, you know, but they are in a tough situation where change is not easy when it is just an individual having to make that choice, when you know, you need systems in place that enable it and encourage it rather than it.
Well, speaking of that, you know, given what's going on the ground, you'd think that the people in the beehive would, you know, be looking at all this, would be looking at the science, would be looking at the concerns from local communities and thinking, oh gosh, we really need to do something about this. But sadly, the men and women in suits seem to be taking things in the opposite direction. Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the implications for freshwater policy are of the recent change of government? Yeah,
it's you'll be shocked to hear that they're going in the complete wrong direction. So there's this new government has they've moved very quickly to bring forward a raft of changes across a raft of different portfolios, and there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, about the fast track bill as one of them. But there's also changes that they're making, and changes that they've signalled to the Resource Management Act, and where they want to make significant changes in the long term, but in the short term, until they've done the work that they need to do to put in place their changes, they're looking to pass an amendment bill to the Resource Management Act. The government wants to make it easier for development to occur, and they are framing themselves as they're pro-development, pro-business, we can't have environmental protections holding back development of the country. And what they're doing with this Resource Management Amendment Bill, it's called the Resource Management, Freshwater and Other Matters Amendment Bill. They're always very interesting names. They want to remove the obligation for regional councils and individuals applying for resource consents to comply with Te Mana o Te Wai and the hierarchy of obligations.
Do you want to tell us what the hierarchy of Te Mana o Te Wai is?
Yeah, so in principle, the hierarchy is it's a way to balance the use of freshwater and activities that can impact freshwater. And the principle is that the health of the freshwater and the freshwater ecosystems are the first priority. The health of communities and their access to drinking water is the second priority, and then all other uses of freshwater, whether that be for commercial purposes or cultural purposes, are the third priority. And it's a way of ensuring that when, or I should say, under the current national policy statement on freshwater management, regional councils, like Environment Canterbury and other regional councils across the country, they have to ensure that a resource consent complies with that hierarchy, which makes sense, right? Like, you want, I think most people, you speak to anyone in the country and you mention, if you put it to them, do you think that the health of your drinking water should be a priority? Do you think the health of the freshwater environment should be a priority? Most people are going to say yes. But what the government wants to do is remove this compliance, essentially, this obligation for regional councils and consentees to comply with that hierarchy. Not only that, but they want to restrict regional councils from even considering the hierarchy of obligations. So it's kind of, even if there were regional councils that wanted to keep using Te Mana o Te Wai as a way to make sound decisions, the government's saying not only do you, not have to comply, we're not going to let you even consider it. It's kind of like, tying their hands behind their backs in terms of, allowing regional councils to make sound decisions over the use of water. Yeah.
Well, some of you watching at home might find that a bit heavy and a bit despairing, so please don't worry. We are going to be talking about reasons for hope soon. And if you do want to take action on what Will's just been talking about, you can take action right now. We have a petition calling on Christopher Luxon's government to keep their hands off freshwater protections, basically to leave those freshwater rules in place that Will mentioned, like Te Mana o Te Wai. So if you want to take action, you can click the link that's going to be showing up in the chat soon and join us in calling on the government to do better, which is what we tend to do around here. Will, that's obviously very concerning, but like I said, we did want to talk about reasons for hope. Something that I picked up on recently was some polling we did in May, I think it was, which showed 76% of Cantabrians are concerned about nitrate contamination in their water, which is a really significant majority. And you mentioned earlier that it's something that you're hearing people talking about in Christchurch. It's kind of well known and established. Do you think that concern about water affects the way that people vote?
Without action, it's easy for folks to despair. And what we've been seeing in Canterbury, and it's certainly the case after travelling around this weekend, is that people do want to have some accountability from their elected officials when it comes to their drinking water. There's folks in Darfield and Oxford, starting to lobby their district council to ensure that they have access to safe drinking water from their water supply. Our district councils, they have a responsibility to provide safe drinking water, but they don't have a lot of control over the source of the water. That falls to ECAN and regional councils. So there's an opportunity there, though, that for district councils actually to be demanding more from regional council to ensure that the regional council is making a decision with resource management to ensure that the source water is protected. And speaking about the conversations you've been having with folks at public water testing meetings, we interviewed an Oxford local named Lewis, and he had his water tested at a town hall testing event. And from leaving the event, and by the time they finished their drive home to Oxford, him and his wife had decided we're going to start doing something about this, and are now mobilising within the Oxford community. Their group is starting to grow, connecting with other folks who are also concerned about drinking water, because yes, there's a lot of concern in rural communities that if I put my head above the parapet a little bit, am I going to get ostracised from my community? But the reality is there's actually loads of people in the community that are concerned about it. So, Lewis and folks in his community are starting to organise, starting to demand more from their council. Similar things are happening in Darfield. Myself and Marnie Prickett and Simon Hales spoke at public meeting in Darfield a few weeks ago that the community had organised themselves because they know now that their town water supply has elevated levels of nitrate, and they want to learn more about it. And we were invited to it, which was fantastic. So, and yeah, I think people were starting, they realise who the decision makers are in this story, and they're starting, and some folks have already got there and they're ready to start lobbying, and other folks are starting to consider, well, what can I do to demand more from our elected officials? Yep.
Yeah. I have to say, one of the things that I love about living in Aotearoa is just that I feel like there is this kind of proactiveness about taking community action. 10 points to whoever can figure out where this weirdo accent comes from. Put it in the chat. But yeah, I've been here for 10 years, and in contrast to Europe, where I was living before, I just feel like there's this real just proactiveness. Yeah, people are like, right, I can do something about this. And I wanted to kind of cast my mind back. We've been here at Greenpeace, we've been working on freshwater for a long time. And we've talked a bit about irrigation. Back in 2016, Greenpeace was part of a kind of broad coalition of organizations working to fight the Ruataniwha Dam in the Hawke's Bay. And so that became a real big election issue in the 2016 local council elections. And that was really because of work from community organizations, Ngāti Kahungunu, Forest and Bird, Greenpeace, all working to challenge the dam. And that included court cases and letter writing and depositions to council and rallies and all sorts of things. And in the end, the people voted around the issue, and the council that was elected was majority opposed to the dam, and eventually they chose to stop public funding from Hawke's Bay Regional Council to the dam. And that momentum, I think, also encouraged the 2017 Labour government, the Jacinda Ardern government, to pull national, sort of central government funding from irrigation schemes as well. And so, that grassroots campaign in the Hawke's Bay, in Canterbury as well, really built some momentum for policy at central government level to stop the expansion of irrigation, which was driving dairy farm expansion, which was a really awesome thing. And I wanted to share another video with the audience, which is really taking a trip down memory lane back to 2017, when we were fighting these irrigation schemes, and a group of really brave activists decided to block construction of the Central Plains water scheme in Canterbury. One of our core values here at Greenpeace Aotearoa is taking nonviolent direct action to kind of stop harm to nature, to stop things in their tracks. And this was a really inspiring example of people doing that almost exactly 7 years ago now. It was in August in 2017. So have a watch of this inspiring video.
This morning, about 7 activists took a brave stand to save our rivers. They locked down the construction of the biggest irrigation scheme currently being built in New Zealand, Central Plains Water, because big irrigation means more cows, and more cows means more polluted rivers.
Prepare for a little how's a stayover? It's like a sleepover.
It's like a sleepover. I'm barricading myself in this little cab so that I can stay here for as long as possible to stop the construction of this irrigation system for as long as possible.
This is those super galvanised chain. Just put the track there around my waist and see how we go there. Get all my supplies up here.
Right. We were just talking as we were watching that about how much we love that video and some of the familiar faces that we saw there. Some really awesome activists who we love. Jules, I wanted to cut back to you after that to just say, you know, you've been with Greenpeace as long as we have been campaigning on freshwater. You were around for that. Mm-hmm. What do you think has changed since that action almost 7 years ago?
It's funny, I was reflecting on my personal life because I was like, oh, look, I came back from my first parental leave and we'd started an agriculture campaign. Yeah, anyway.
There's worse things to come back to.
Yes, that is very true. I actually think it's something that you have touched on, Will, and that is the willingness and determination of people to start speaking out. Mm-hmm. When we first started doing the testing events, at least, it was very, very hard to get people to come and maybe speak to media if they were present, or to even come and talk to us when we were trying to do documentary style films, and so it's maybe testament to how much worse it has gotten in that time, and therefore the kind of the desperation that people are seeing. But maybe it's also the fact that this issue has been brought to the forefront again and again, and people can see that they are not alone. And so even if they feel like they have to speak out in their own communities, and that might be hard because they don't want to offend their neighbours and their friends, it is something that they now feel supported enough and strongly enough about to do. So for me, I think that's probably the biggest switch that I have seen, that it's so much more in the media, and people are just feeling like they can speak up.
Yeah, and Jules touched upon the interviews that you guys were doing over the weekend. Did you find that it was? Did you find that people wanted to tell their story, wanted to talk about it?
Yeah, it was actually just reflecting on something you just mentioned, because we spent a lot of time driving around and we were interviewing specific people we'd organised interviews with, but we also had a lot of time just to chat with people that we ran into out and about. There was one moment, more than once it happened actually, where we were at the top of the Rakaia Gorge at one point, and a similar situation happened at Te Waihora, which is an environmental catastrophe, and we just started, speaking with some of the folks there, and you kind of sometimes wonder, how are we going to get, how receptive are they going to be to us? We're Greenpeace. Are they going to be, combative? Are they going to be friendly? But, we mentioned that where we're from, we work for Greenpeace, this is what we're doing, talking about the water, and it's almost like that. They'll go, oh yeah, no, the nitrates are really bad, dairy farming. And you don't even have to, broach the subject of where this pollution's coming from. People were becoming much more willing, even just complete strangers, out and about on this, walking their dog on the side of the river, willing and open to talk about, the issue. Some of the interviews that we had with people were really difficult in the sense that they were so heartbreaking. Especially the interviews that we did with tangata whenua. The first interview that we did was with Joan Bergman, who's in her 80s and has spent most of her life actually trying to protect her local river, and just the shit, frankly, that she's had to put up with from Environment Canterbury and others, and not just her, but other tangata whenua in her community, and yeah, it was really tough to have to listen to those stories, and you feel this sense of responsibility after hearing those stories that we have a lot of work to do. Maruto was another one who took us down to the riverbed, and we were standing in mud that was like in our gumboots, you know, almost up our leg, when it shouldn't be like that. It should be, you know, essentially shingle. And he's talking about how, you know, he doesn't even want to feed the kai he catches from that river to his kids anymore because it's so unsafe. And the water was basically green, like it was disgusting. I guess to answer your question, yes, people were very willing and open, at least to us, were very, very willing and open to tell us about, you know, their stories. There's an element, I think, of some apprehension, especially in places like Oxford and Darfield, where it's deep in, you know, dairy country, but still willing to acknowledge the, you know, the giant cow in the room, so to speak, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think Canterbury really is kind of ground zero for water pollution from intensive dairying, and I think that's something that we can see clearly in the map as well. So yeah, if you haven't checked out the map yet, please do go and check out the Know Your Nitrate map. And I'm going to ask Jules some questions about why we produce this map, but it really is when you zoom in and you look at Canterbury, particularly around sort of Ashburton, you know, you can really see that it's a hot spot for nitrate contamination. So Jules, do you want to tell us a little bit about how the nitrate map came to be? And also I just want to acknowledge there's quite a lot of questions coming in, and I promise I'm going to come to the questions very soon. I just want Jules to talk us through the map a little bit first, because I promise it's interesting.
So I think the map was bubbling around in the campaigner's head, who was leading the campaign at the time for probably, I don't know, at least a few months, probably already in 2022. And it actually came into fruition at the end of last year. And basically the idea of this nitrate map was that Greenpeace had collected this quite unique data set, whereby we had collected data that showed the nitrate levels of people's actual drinking water. So a lot of the data that's available at the moment is based on what's called groundwater monitoring. And so those are bores that are being monitored, and but that doesn't mean that those bores are actually supplying people's drinking water, or the council's drinking water supplies. And so quite often the thing that came up when we were pointing to the contamination levels for these groundwater monitoring results, were people saying, yeah, but that's not the water that people are drinking. They are drinking water from other bores, so they'll be okay. And it's like, well, actually, no. We now have this data set that shows very clearly that people are drinking water that is not safe for them to drink. And so that's kind of how the idea came about. Let's try and visualize this and find a way of people being able to access that information very easily.
Yeah.
Now, our data set in itself wouldn't have felt big enough to paint the picture solidly. And so what we did is we took our data, we took data from the groundwater monitoring that I was talking about previously. We took data sets from land, air and water Aotearoa. We got a data set supplied through an organisation called GNS. I think they're a 150-year-old organisation for geological and nuclear research. We got data sets from the councils around the country and the groundwater monitoring that they did. And then that's kind of looking at all the kind of bore water data, as well as then another layer in the map where we collaborated with a researcher called Tim Chambers and his team. And they supplied us with a data set that basically looks at all the town supplies, so that's the rural town supply, the rural public supply, as well as the town supplies that people tap into. And so all of a sudden you have this whole picture of Aotearoa, and the water that people are drinking or being supplied with. And we just tried to find a way of keeping it really simple, and we just wanted people to be able to go in, type in their address, and zoom into the area that they are living or that they're interested in, and they could see what the readings in that area were saying. So we kind of always put a disclaimer on and said, hey, if you really want to know what's coming out of your tap, you need to send us a sample and we can test it for you and we can return the results to you. But really the point is, there is nowhere else where this information is centralized. You have to know where to look. You have to know the different organizations that you can reach out to. And from experience, yes, you can go and ask your council what's in your water, but they don't always hand over that information very quickly. I mean, we had moments where we had to put Lagoimas through, so that's it's like an official information act for a local or regional council. So it's, yes, the information's there, but the information's not always readily available, and so that was the point of the map. Put all that information in one place and make it very easily searchable, and make it visual.
Yeah, and you mentioned the little disclaimer that, like, yes, you can go on the map and you can type in your address and you might see what some samples from nearby have tested. But the only way to know what exactly is coming out of your tap is to get that drinking water tested. We have had a question from the audience about how you can get your drinking water tested. And do you, Jules, want to talk the audience through what happens if you order, or how to order a testing kit and what happens if they order one?
So, I mean, you can get your water tested through an official lab. So, for example, an organised or a company like Hill Laboratories will do that, but that's usually very costly, and most people can't easily afford that. And so, Greenpeace a couple of years ago started what we call our mail-in testing service. And so, you can go to Greenpeace's website, and if you type in Greenpeace free nitrate testing, it'll come up with a link where you can fill in a form, and you just give us some details about the water that you want to have tested and your postal address, and we send a kit, and I brought one.
Yeah, and I think the link to order a kit will also be in the chat, so you don't have to Google it. Hopefully it'll be right there ready for you. Tell us what happens.
Here's what I preferred earlier. So you will, in the post, receive a kit that has a sterile sample container and a sticker, and you just write your information on there, put it on, fill in the container, and then you also get an information leaflet that kind of talks about the different levels of nitrate contamination, and that'll be really helpful once you receive your results. And you get a letter saying all the things that are inside and how to collect the sample and all the things that you kind of should watch out for. And then you return the sample to us, you get a prepaid envelope. And then funnily enough, they go to a mail house, and then I go and pick them up and I test them. And then a few days after I've tested them, you'll get an email with your results. And if you have a very high reading, you'll also get a call from Will. Just to talk you through it. But I think the point is that we take it quite seriously. It's an automated process, but there's also people behind it that take it seriously. And if we have high readings, we get it retested. We get the water retested by an independent lab, just to make sure that we send out the right results. And also we know that it's hard to hear if you have a high reading, and so that's usually when we follow up with a call. If people want to hear from us again, you get to tell us if you don't want to.
Cool. Thank you so much, Jules. I think because we've already started taking audience questions, I'm going to take a few more. So we've had one question come through asking, and I'll put this to Will, how realistic is it to hope for swimmable rivers and drinkable water once again? What time frame is needed for that within our lifetimes?
Yeah, it's certainly hopeful, and one has to have hope in this line of work. But yeah, it's not something that's going to happen in overnight. it takes time for the freshwater ecosystem, or for the nitrate essentially that's already in the aquifers to filter through and to flow through before we'll start seeing, you know, those elevated nitrate levels start to reduce. But what that means is that we need to start changing our land use sooner rather than later, and that means putting a sinking cap on the use of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser, because that's the primary cause really of the pollution in the water, the elevated nitrate levels. So that needs to happen sooner rather than later, and the sooner we can do that, then we will start to see the water systems improve over time. And if we can do that, then I'm very optimistic that it can happen within our lifetime, for sure.
And for people who are feeling inspired by the Kōrero today, people who are based in Canterbury where you are, like what could they do to get involved?
Yeah, so of course sign a petition, hands off our freshwater protections. That's a great way to start. And jump on our website and reach out to us if and you can become a volunteer for Greenpeace and you can help us on this campaign. But not even that, you can, you know, start organising within your own community. I mentioned, you know, earlier there's our good friend Lewis in Oxford. He's starting to organise with folks in the area, and their group is growing. And there are it's happening in Darfield as well. And there's nothing stopping anyone, anywhere really, from starting to mobilise, starting to work together to make a difference. So, and we can help you with that as well. Like if you're concerned about your drinking water, and you're concerned about the elevated levels of nitrate, or you're concerned about the degraded waterways or the unswimmable rivers, and you want to help Greenpeace with our campaign, get in touch. If you're concerned about all of those things, but you want to organise in your own community under your own banner, get in touch. We can help. You know, we are very much an organisation that's, you know, we're led by that principle of people power and mobilising people power. You know, it's very difficult to fight, you know, an industry that's very well financed with money, because the industry is very well financed, and you know, day-to-day folks aren't, but day-to-day folks have numbers. So it's about having those conversations in your community, making those connections with other folks who are concerned, and starting working together to apply pressure on the people who are responsible for ensuring that you have access to safe drinking water and ensuring that the waterways are swimmable. There are people who have authority and have levers of power to make those decisions, and they're currently not using them. But you can apply pressure to make them feel uncomfortable about maybe losing their elected position, and start, you know, pulling some of those levers to make a difference.
Yeah, and if there are particular things that you would like, you know, things that you would like support with, if you're interested in writing letters to your local paper, or you want to know more about volunteer groups in your area, one of the people that we have behind the camera is our lovely Elliot, who looks after all the ways that we can help people sort of take action in different ways. So please send through your requests or your thoughts in the comments as well. So I would love to hear a little bit more. That question from the audience was kind of thinking about, like, what might we be able to see in our lifetimes? Is there hope for the future? Will, if you could cast yourself sort of 20 years into the future, and I assume you're still going to be living in Canterbury, you've been there your whole life, so you're probably still going to be there. What do you think rural Canterbury would look and feel like 20 years from now if we have taken action to solve this problem? Yeah,
yes, the Greenpeace office is up in Auckland, but I'm staying in Canterbury for sure. Yeah, so it's during the weekend when we were on the road filming this documentary, one of the rivers that we stopped by was the Aotearoa River, which is one of the rivers that I grew up around. And the water looks clear, but it was lifeless, and it was full of weeds and muck and slime. And And that's not how it should be. The weeds, grow so much because of all the nutrients that have gone into the water, and they choke the rivers. So aquatic life can't survive. If I cast my mind to the future, I want to see those rivers full of life again, but to be restored and to an extent where they are full of life in one way or another. The biodiversity has been restored, where communities in tangata whenua can go to the river to gather kai, where we don't have to go onto the Lawa website and check, is this river swimmable before going for a swim. But for that to happen, we need land use change, right? We need to be, the agriculture sector needs to change to a more sustainable model, to a more sustainable system. And that will mean, reducing the inputs, that technical term, the inputs that go into the ground. And when we say inputs, we mean synthetic nitrogen fertiliser. That's what's required in many parts of the country, especially Canterbury, to grow all that pasture along with the irrigation. You wouldn't be able to sustain that many cattle on the land without the fertiliser and all the irrigation. That's what I'd like to see happen.
Mm-hmm. I've got a last question for you, Jules, which is just kind of, a lot of the time this work can feel really heavy. You're speaking with local communities directly about, or giving them test results which show that they might be at increased risk of health impacts. We're hearing about how this government wants to weaken freshwater protection instead of making it stronger. We haven't talked about it tonight, but we know there's also the animal welfare impacts of intensive dairying. So this stuff can feel quite heavy. What are some things that give you hope or make you kind of feel the most empowered when you're taking on this work?
One of the things that I was reflecting on that we hadn't talked about yet was, and it came out when we were talking about what people can do if they want to get involved, was that one of the things that makes these events always really special is the local volunteers and activists who come and show up. And it's amazing because they usually, they are local, and so the chats that they can have with people as they come in feel very real, because they can relate to their kind of surroundings and kind of all the important places and all the conversations that have been happening. And so I guess it's a big shout out to those people for always showing up. Whether it's Jenny in Southland or Kate in Taranaki, or our latest trip when we were in North Canterbury, it was amazing. The host of volunteers that showed up was amazing. I think we had about 10 people all in across the 3 days, and they were so engaged. We had a local GP, which was amazing because actually there was a moment where he was talking to somebody who had helped birth. So it was just like one of those. It's like, wow, I was at your birth and now we're talking about this and your kids, and it's fascinating. And I just think having people show up is so important. So that's something that really gives me hope. There are always people that want to help, and whether that's volunteers organised through Greenpeace, or whether that's someone showing up with something like 10 samples at a water testing event because they've gone around their friends and said, I'm driving over to this. Do you want me to take your samples? And it's amazing. It's just that human connection counts for so much. And I think it goes a little bit to what you were saying. It's like, yep, the corporations have got the money, but they don't necessarily have the people power. And we do. So I think that gives me hope. And in terms of doing little things myself, yes, it's great to be able to do the town hall testing and do the mail-in testing. But if I feel like I need to do something more, I think it's then going and doing the next step. And for a long time, I've not been able to go on the big non-violent direct actions because small children and all those things make it hard. But that doesn't mean that you can't do things behind the scenes either. I have sewn many a banners, and I've made lots of sandwiches. And so I think even if you either aren't comfortable outright on the blockades, locking yourself to the diggers like we saw people do in the video earlier, there is ways that you can engage, and I think it's really important because it's a way that you can really connect.
Thanks, Jules. I think that's a really beautiful place to wrap this up. And we would love to hear all of your reasons for feeling hopeful in these quite dark times as well. So please do put them in the chat. And if you are feeling inspired by the kōrero today, don't forget to take action, to sign that petition to Christopher Luxon's government to keep those freshwater rules in place. Get in touch if you want to volunteer. If you're based in Canterbury and you want to do more, you will probably see and work with Will directly. And if you want to get your water tested, then Jules will be testing it for you. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do is just please make sure to hit subscribe, because we would love to fill you in on all of our great campaigns that we're doing here at Greenpeace Aotearoa. The next YouTube Live is going to be on, I think, 2 weeks from today, and it is about deep sea mining. So you're going to be hearing from some of our colleagues who are working on protecting the vast oceans, including here in Aotearoa and also in the wider Pacific, from this new industry that is trying to ravage the oceans for profit, and we don't want to see any of that, do we? So thank you so much for tuning in tonight, and yeah, join us again in a couple of weeks.